Good morning.
Good morning.
The subject of supply is one of the most fascinating subjects for study and experiment and experience in the message of the infinite way. The reason is that you cannot approach the subject of supply in the sense of believing that we need money or automobiles or houses or homes, because that would be the old metaphysical attempt to demonstrate effects. And this must always be a failure, because you might sometimes demonstrate effects and then be very sorry for it later. You see, you start your whole infinite way experience from the standpoint of the truth that we are offspring of God. That is, that we are spiritual and heirs of God, joint heirs to all the heavenly riches. And then, if we've been metaphysically trained, we turn right around and try to turn heavenly riches into houses and automobiles and dollars. And of course we lose the whole contact there. When Scripture says, "Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things," it doesn't add that thy grace gives me dollars and automobiles and houses. It says that thy grace is my sufficiency. And as spiritual beings, we have to be satisfied with that statement that all we are seeking is thy grace. Now, grace always interprets itself at the level of the moment in which we are living, so that as we realize the sufficiency of thy grace, it will appear to us as air to breathe or transportation or dollars or whatever our life at the moment may require. And it can very well appear in forms that we could not possibly expect. Our idea of what constitutes supply may differ entirely with God's idea for us at this moment. Our idea of where we would like to live or what work we would like to do may differ entirely from God's. And here you must remember something. If you remember that you are spiritual and the offspring of God, you must remember that you are a child in a far different way than children of earth are children of their parents. When parents have children, they don't know what they're going to do with them or what the children are going to do with themselves. They just bring them into the world and hope for the best. And they try to guide them. But how can they guide them except in accord with their own concept of what is right? And so if my father is a businessman, he thinks the highest right is to make me a businessman. And I should be in religious work. And so because of that, I have to fight my way out of the business world into religious work. Not because my father doesn't love me, but because my Father's idea of good, of right, is what was good and right for him. But now this is not true of God. God is omniscience. And when God has a child, it is for a specific purpose. There is something definite in mind with every individual offspring. Something that they were actually sent into expression to do. As humans, we have completely missed the mark, because most of the activities of humans were not intended for us. And in our ignorance, we went into business or something else. So it is that when you say that thy grace is my sufficiency in all things, you have to turn within with an open mind and stand on that word grace and let it assume the form necessary. And if it shocks you out of your skin, you have to be willing to be shocked. And if it makes you leave mother, brother, father, and sister, you leave mother, brother, father, and sister. And if it makes you leave your Holy Lands to go over to Europe to proselyte, you leave your Holy Lands and go to Europe or Asia and proselyte. In other words, Saul of Tarsus was never meant to be a proselyter of Christianity in Europe and Asia. But that's what he became the moment he came under grace. Now, when you see supply in this light, you see it as grace, and you see it as a gift of God, and you have no outline of what the form is. You can very well be more surprised than a child going to the Christmas tree on Christmas morning and finding the things it doesn't expect. What it receives is its parents' sense of love. They're giving it something, not necessarily that the child wants, but what the parent feels it's for its good. This is much more true as we go to the Father for divine grace. It is utterly hopeless to have an idea of what gifts we would like, what form the grace should assume, what form the supply should be. Because omniscience knows all, and it knows all about every individual, because omniscience is the allness of every individual, and therefore omniscience operates within us to reveal its plan for us. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. It is along the same line as prayer is understood in the infinite way. Prayer is only effective in the measure that we go to God without a desire. Because otherwise we are holding a mold up to God and say, fill it for us. Here's the mold of my wish, of my desire. Become my servant and do what I would like, and so forth. You see, the infinite way has no such form of prayer. The prayer is an opening of consciousness to the presence and the activity of God. It is the same in our healing work. There is no use of our going to God with a desire that God heal us, or that God heal this claim or that disease or that lack. Real prayer is an opening of consciousness to God and then a communing within. Now, the fruitage of this kind of prayer and the fruitage of seeking supply in this way as grace is that sooner or later the revelation is given to you within yourself. Do not look to me, because, son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is already thine. It was incorporated in you in the beginning before Abraham was. When, in our oneness with God in the beginning, He incorporated into us His life, His mind, His soul, His spirit, His substance, His supply, His infinity. And He can add nothing to us now. Nor are there any powers on earth to take from us, as long as we live in the realization that our infinity, our grace and our gift, is ours by virtue of our relationship to God, the oneness that was established with Him in the beginning. Then, when this is revealed to us, we perceive why the poet could say, "You must open out a way for the imprisoned splendor to escape." Since infinity is the measure of my supply, and it cannot be added to, I must start pouring. I must start the outflow. And so it is that in every department of our lives, we must constantly search, while we're on the subject of supply, not to see how we can get or what we can get, but in what way we are not pouring. Because this is where the damming up of supply comes in our not pouring in some manner. Well, there are times when you will find it very difficult to impart this to students because an embarrassment arises. They are apt to get the impression that you want them to give something to you, and that you are using this gentle way of hinting. But when they are further enlightened, they will know this, that as a teacher, you must already have reached that stage where you understand that you are spiritually fed and that you are not looking to them. And then, of course, that impression will not prevail. The reason the impression prevails is that so many religious teachings insist that the follower support the priests, ministers, church. Whereas in a spiritual teaching, it must be the minister or the priest or the teacher who must support the student. Otherwise, the teacher knows more than the student knows more than the teacher. Therefore, this can never enter the spiritual teacher's consciousness, because the spiritual teacher does not go into a ministry until they have demonstrated that they are living by God's grace. Then, when they have demonstrated that, they can freely say, now the secret of supply is in giving, and we are not concerning ourselves at the moment merely with money, because money is the least of the givingness of which we are talking. The real givingness is the spiritual treasures that have been given to us that we are willing to share. You see, the kingdom of God is full of spiritual treasures. We are a storehouse of spiritual treasures since long before we became visible. And we are not so busy storing up where moth and rust corrupt as we are storing up spiritual treasures. But we are not storing them up in the sense of withholding them. We're storing them up in the sense of spending them, because it is in the spending of them that we are really storing them up. This, of course, is a contradiction to the human sense, but anyone who has ever taught any subject whatsoever, must know that the more of it they teach, the more they know themselves. That must be inevitable, whether or not they are teaching bookkeeping or architecture or languages or science, art. The more they teach, the greater their own unfoldment. And of course this is probably even more true in our spiritual life, because it is true that if we were to start with one passage of Scripture and start to share it with another person, that almost before you know it, a second passage would jump into our head. And if we kept on talking, a third one and a fourth one, and eventually one would come out that we never knew before. And we'd say, now where did that come from? Yet unbeknownst to us, it was stored up in our consciousness. It was just such a happening that originally brought me to Hawaii. While driving from San Francisco to Los Angeles in my car, all of a sudden I heard, "He performeth that which is given me to do." And it repeated itself, and I thought, now that's either the Bible or Shakespeare. But since I have a concordance to the Bible, I'll look it up. That was the first time I had ever heard that passage. And sure enough, not only it says in the Bible, "He performeth that which is given me to do," but "He perfecteth that which concerneth me." And I rested in that. And then when I reached Los Angeles, the telephone bell rang and I was called to Hawaii. And it proved to be true. There was a case of a man dying with a heart attack. And by the time I got here, having given him help, and within a very short time, he was completely healed. But he that had called me here had performed the work. Then why call me here? Because the whole work unfolded here from this point, you see. Now, it is for this reason that students may say, "But nobody calls on me for help." And of course, that may be true in the earliest stages of their study, and rightly so, because divine grace wouldn't allow anyone to call on those who are unprepared. And therefore, it is our function, really, never to want to give help, never to want to be in the ministry, never want to do anything, but stay home, perfect ourselves, study, meditate, let our consciousness become so filled with the activity of the Christ that in a certain moment it breaks out, and the first thing you know, somebody comes and asks for help, and then that starts us on our way. Well, during that period, there is something that every student can do, and that is that as long as they are engaging in prayer and meditation for themselves or for their families, they can certainly spare a little time for the rest of the world. Now, probably some may not have thought of this. They are all so confident that the world is going to be saved. Everyone is so confident that ultimately we're going to have a good world, that perhaps just the passing of time is going to do it, or the evolution of human consciousness. But of course they are barking up the wrong tree. Human consciousness is built on self-preservation as the first law of human nature, and therefore the longer human consciousness evolves, the more ways it's going to find of preserving itself at somebody else's expense. The world hasn't been saved since before the days of Pharaoh and unto the present day. And if the world is to be saved, it is to be saved not by human beings discovering bigger and better bombs or bigger and better United Nations, because all of these are activities that ultimately destroy. If the world is to be saved, it will be by the activity of the Christ in human consciousness. The world is only a world of individuals. And just as we could go on being human beings from the cradle to the grave and still die human beings, so can the whole world go on the same way. And it is only because in some measure the activity of the Christ has touched our individual consciousness that we are finding ourselves in some measure freed of the world's problems. Certainly we have far less of the world's problems than the world has. Certainly everybody on the spiritual path is discovering that they have less of the world's problems, or that they are better enabled to meet those problems. And it is in this same degree then that the activity of the Christ in human consciousness will eventually erase human consciousness, so that there will no longer be a self-preservation as the first law of human nature. Now, how did we come to the spiritual path? How did an activity of Christ touch our consciousness? And the answer is that neither you nor I know. We only know what happened after we were directed to the message. We do not know what it is that directed us. We do not know what it is that enabled us to open a book and say, this is it, I must follow it, I must go further. Whereas 99 other people opened the same book and said, I can't see anything in that. Do you see? If the power was in the book, then 100 people would find it in the book and it would all be there. But the power isn't in the book, the power is in your consciousness. Now then, what prepared your consciousness to be able, and sometimes through a great deal of difficulties, to follow a spiritual path? And the only thing you can say is it was grace. Now, as a matter of fact, that grace may have come about by somebody in the world praying and you responding to it. It may have come about by a friend, a relative, or a stranger praying. And somewhere, somehow or other, a longing inside of you touched it, and grace could begin to function. Because there is no other way to understand the experiences that I witness in the mail of people who say, I went into a public library and I opened one of your books and I knew I was home and I immediately went out and bought more books. And yet, in that same library, dozens of other people probably see the same book and pass it by. Or another one says, I was in a bus and I picked up a book or a pamphlet and so forth. Or a friend who said they couldn't understand it gave me the book. They understood it. Now, there's no way to understand this except that an activity of grace readied them for it. And I am convinced that no spiritually illumined person has ever died. True, each one in their turn passes from our physical sight because it is inevitable. It could not be possible for everybody to remain on earth forever in the monotony of human living. And therefore, there must be a progressive state to which we all go forward. But wouldn't it be horrible to think of 10, 20, 30, 40 years that we have given to a spiritual study and activity and then feel that it all ended because we passed on? I can't accept that. I just cannot accept it. I believe that the Master said, lay up spiritual treasures where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, because while we leave the material things at the probate court, I know we take the spiritual treasures with us. What do we do with them? Well, since when we leave here we really don't go anyplace. Life is an activity of consciousness, and it's lived in consciousness. So therefore we never escape out of consciousness. We do with it what we've always done. We pray and we meditate, and anywhere that anybody is receptive and responsive, they come under its influence. And therefore, there is nothing quite so real to me as the fact that Buddha and Moses and Jesus and Elisha and Elijah and John and Paul are still about their Father's business. And that even though we are lesser lights, that as we go into their domain, that we too continue, because we're no longer interested in laying up the treasures that we've already learned are going to be taken from us, so from now on we won't even bother to lay them up. And we will now give all of our attention to this. Therefore, everyone who engages in a world prayer activity of a real prayer nature, I don't mean the old prayer that asks God to do something or give us victory or the other fellow defeat, but I mean the real prayer of spiritual contact. They must be reaching somebody somewhere. Somebody on a sickbed is being raised up. Somebody on a deathbed is being raised up. Somebody in an accident is being lifted up. Or somebody in some phase of mortality is being raised and led to where they're going to meet the person or the book that will start them on the path. And so I see it as a mission of every Infinite Way student to give not less than one period each day for an intelligent world meditation. In the early years of our study of the Infinite Way, we must abide by the specific principles of this message very carefully, very closely and very intensely, because the study and practice of these principles develops our consciousness to where we no longer hate, fear, or love the human scene. We develop our consciousness to that place where we recognize that there is something greater than ourselves functioning within us. We of ourselves could never do the things that we are called upon to do. We of ourselves could not help people to overcome serious diseases, or to lose sins and false appetites, or to mold new dispositions. There is nothing about us as people that would ever enable us to do that for another. It is only when we have been touched by that which is transcendental, by that which is spiritual, that we can at least approach Paul in his statement, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, or the Master's, I can of my own self do nothing, the Father doeth the works. The study and practice of specific infinite way principles raises our consciousness because it helps us to overcome fear of anything in the manifest realm. It helps us to realize the non-power of what the world calls power. As we progress in this work through study and practice, and as some measure of the Spirit of God enters our consciousness, we find ourselves called upon to help others. The others may not know why they come to us. It is something they feel. But they do come and they do ask our help, and generally we can give it. Usually by the time they come asking for help, we have the spiritual endowment that makes it possible to give them their help. Eventually this begins to dawn in the consciousness of every spiritual student, regardless of his approach. If this that functions through me for the benefit of myself and others, if it is so powerful, can it not then help the entire world? If I can pray for my neighbor, and my neighbor benefits by my prayer, can I not then pray for the entire world? Praying for the entire world has been going on for centuries. But it is only as we rise higher in the understanding and the demonstration of prayer that we will witness a greater fulfillment of spiritual peace on earth, spiritual harmony on earth. It is true that a great deal of the praying that has been going on for centuries, both in the visible scene and in the invisible scene, has had and is having an effect upon mankind. Thinking of the world from the standpoint of the consciousness of mankind, we must admit that the world is better today than it was a century ago. I am not talking about the effects that we witness in the world today, such as man's inhumanity to man, the threats of atomic bombs, the continued slavery of one kind or another, or the domination of one people upon another. No, there are still areas of consciousness in which much room for improvement is needed. But let us put it this way. There is far less inclination to go to war. There is less inclination to stage the vicious union strikes that were known 40 years ago. And there is a greater inclination on the part of mankind to care for the less fortunate. Some of you may not believe this. In my own lifetime, orphanages and homes for the aged were horrible places. Orphans were put on farms to do hard manual labor. They were more than servants, they were really slaves. They were put out in families to be family drudges. All of this has been done away with. In my own younger days, all that a workman had to look forward to when he reached the age of 50 or 60, when he became physically incapacitated, was either to be supported by his children or to be sent to a home for the indigents. There were no benefits provided for him by the government or by industry, and much less known of insurance. So never was it his fault that he became indigent. All of this has been changing. Yes, consciousness is at a higher level today than it was even 50 years ago, and far greater than it was a century ago, when, remember, the racial, religious, and color hatreds of those days. Since it is impossible for the human mind to improve itself, it must be evident that the prayers of those who understand the real nature of prayer, both on this side and the other side, must prevail. When I speak of those on the other side, I am speaking primarily of the spiritually enlightened who have left this plane of life. I doubt whether any of you believe that Jesus Christ is dead, or that his spiritual function stopped at the crucifixion or the resurrection or the ascension. I cannot believe that you believe that the great contribution Buddha made, or the contributions made by John or Paul or thousands of others, stopped when they stopped breathing. What do you believe about yourself? Do you believe that all of the devotion and all of the dedication you have given to a spiritual study is going to come to an end? What then must you think of God? Those who are on the spiritual path are on it only by the grace of God. Look around you, out in the world, at the billions who are not on the spiritual path, and then you will know that they cannot arrive there until they are touched by the Spirit of God. And when the Spirit of God touches them, they cannot stay away. Do you really think the Spirit of God makes us in some degree a light to others and then puts out that light? Impossible. I know why the Master told us, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. This is the answer. The material treasures you pile up you must leave behind. It is true that it all gets checked out at the probate court. But the spiritual treasures that you have laid up in your consciousness walk right out of here with you. In fact, that is what makes you you. Just as the degree of your spiritual understanding makes you you, and not the creature or the natural man. You are what you are by virtue of your attained spiritual consciousness, and you will be greater than you are in the measure of your greater attainment of spiritual consciousness. Never believe that any condition or circumstance is going to end you, or end your service to God or man. What God is storing up in you in spiritual treasures, you are not only going to give back here on earth, but you will give back in multiplied experiences when you have dropped whatever material sense of existence you still carry. There have been and are people on earth who really have attained an understanding of the nature of prayer. And a great many who have passed from the visible scene are transforming human consciousness by their dedication to prayer. It is for this reason that the world is becoming more spiritualized. To become spiritualized means to come into contact with spiritual consciousness. And never believe that a piling up of years or a piling up of centuries has anything to do with it. It is the dedicated consciousness of individuals who understand the nature of prayer. This is transforming the world. Everyone who has attained enough spiritual endowment to help relieve the world of its pains, sins, diseases, lacks, and limitations must inevitably turn to the larger subject of world work or praying for the world. In this you must remember that you do not pray as others pray, that our enemies be defeated, and that our allies achieve victories. You do not pray for the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party, or the Socialist Party, because all such prayers bring you down to the level of attempting to improve the human scene by utilizing your own human judgment. In order to pray aright, you must not pray for any earthly conditions. Even though you should believe that you have a plan which would save the world, do not pray for it. There never has been a man on earth so good that he would know how to make laws which would benefit everyone. No one has ever been that intelligent. Humanhood is based on the law of self-preservation as the first law of human nature, so nothing of a human nature will save the world. Only one thing will save the world, and nothing else: the activity of the Christ operating in human consciousness. One thing and one thing alone can save your individual life, and that is the activity of the Christ in your consciousness. That and that alone can bring you to the life that God meant you to lead when He created you in the beginning in His image and likeness. You have all witnessed good men become bad and intelligent men who lost their intelligence. You have all witnessed human good, but never have you witnessed human good working impersonally and impartially for the good of everyone. That is the failure of the League of Nations, and will be the failure of the United Nations, because they are not met there to work equally for the good of all. Each representative is there to work for the interest of his country or his race or his religion. Man cannot become that good humanly, but he can when he is spiritually endowed. You cannot pray for peace on earth because you are praying for an effect. You can only pray that the kingdom of God be realized on earth as it is in heaven, and then that realization will bring peace. If through your experiences with a spiritual message you have had some proof or conviction that in the presence of the Christ the carnal mind is not power, then you can go on to the greater realization that the carnal mind is the arm of flesh or nothingness. And if you can witness the carnal mind as nothingness, you should have no trouble at all in engaging in world work. And realize that there is only one carnal mind, whether it is manifesting as one individual or as a billion individuals. When you can perceive that the carnal mind is none power in the realization of the presence of the Christ, you are helping nullify it for the world. It is not enough to remember that the carnal mind is not power. It is not power only in the realization of the presence of the Christ. One with God is a majority. Understand this: the carnal mind is power on its own level of action. Those who want to throw bombs are going to throw bombs until the activity of the Christ stops them. Nothing else is going to stop them. It loses its power, this carnal mind, only when it comes in contact with the Christ, with your consciousness. There is no darkness in the presence of light. In thy presence is fullness of joy. Wherever Jesus moved with his Christ-activated consciousness, sin, disease, and death disappeared on his coming. And so it is in some measure with each one of you. Wherever you move with some measure of spiritual endowment, some measure of sin and disease must walk out. It must dissolve. Since we are agreeing that there is but one carnal mind, there is no reason why 10 righteous men should not nullify the carnal mind of the whole world. Everyone is not receptive, but fortunately we do not have to wait for everyone. Be concerned only with this realization, that the activity of the Christ in your consciousness dispels the carnal mind. When I approach spiritual work, it is not to change any set of human circumstances. My only interest is the realization of the activity of the Christ dissolving mortal sense. Remember, there is only one claim: that the carnal mind has power. It not only has evil power, but sometimes it can even have a good power. All the race movement in the world today is the result of spiritual endowment, because always there have been those who could say there is only one. And because of these, we have had a righteous prayer to stir up this racial situation and eventually lead us into the tomorrow of oneness. But all of the parades you witness, they are really the carnal mind trying to be good. But it is not being good, because it will not bring freedom. Freedom, equality, and justice are brought about only by a change of consciousness. And so the real workers will work behind the scenes by realizing the activity of the Christ dissolving human beliefs, human theories, human modes, and human antagonisms. When you stop to think of the price that was paid in the Civil War to free the Negro, and then realize how miserably it failed, you must understand that this was the carnal mind on both sides. Had God entered that scene, there would have been freedom. We are not going to pray for an end to racial strife, or that the world be humanly better. Our prayer always is the recognition of the non-power of the carnal mind and the activity of the Christ in human consciousness. Then you will witness the changes on earth. You know, if you were to pray to remove the sins of your friends or relatives or community, and you succeeded, do you not know that their human mind is still fertile ground to take on some more sins? And so you would have to pray tomorrow to remove those sins. And that is why the Master taught that if you remove error, one error, you might be making room for 7 more to enter. So you're not really setting about to make men better. And you're not praying that they lose their sins. You're losing that the activity of the Christ take over their consciousness, because when it does, there's no sin left in it, nor is there any room for sin to get into the Christ mind, which has now replaced the human mind. If you lived in a southern town of 10,000 people, and 8,000 of these people were Negroes of little or no education, I'm sure you can understand that you would have difficulty granting them equality. Yes, you might very well be on the side of those whom you consider now the most backward of people. What would you do, you ask? If you were praying spiritually, you would not be called upon for an answer to that. You would be called upon only for the recognition of the reign of the Christ. And then you would see the matter be taken care of, and there would be a transitional change. Had the education of the Negro and his culture begun after the Civil War, who would care today if they did vote in the majority? Who cares in Hawaii that the Japanese are voting in the majority? Who cares? Nobody cares, because the Japanese have reached the point of education, culture, spiritual endowment, and nobody objects. But think what objection there would be if this was happening and the Japanese were at the cultural, educational, or spiritual level of the Negro in the South. So do you not see that it is really not who votes or who votes in the majority? If we are all, let us say, Americans or English or whatever country we are in, and we are all equally educated, cultured, and of spiritual endowment, who cares who votes in the majority? And that is when the day will come when you will witness a United Nations that can vote. Because there will not be 101 countries educationally, culturally, spiritually unendowed voting in the majority. Watch this in your own thought and begin to see that you must not care a person's race, religion, nation, nor who's in the majority, as long as you are helping to provide everyone with education, culture, and spiritual endowment. And then you will be able to say, we are all one in Christ Jesus. The world must face the fact that the Negro and the Asiatic races are in the majority, and someday they may control this entire world by majority vote. And the only way to prepare for it and to be utterly indifferent to it is to say, for heaven's sakes, let us send education, culture, and spiritual endowment into Africa and into the Asiatic countries so that we can all meet in classrooms or halls of Congress and rejoice in it. This is worth considering, because in the days of William Randolph Hearst, when he built his empire on the threat of the yellow races, don't you think for a moment that he didn't have far vision. He saw the day when Asia and Africa would be in the majority numerically. See that? The only thing he didn't see was that it wouldn't make any difference if he had led a campaign to send education into Africa and Asia and culture and so forth. This is a big thought that we are taking up here today, a tremendous subject. Give it a lot more thought. Once you let the activity of the Christ take over, in a generation or two it will prove that we are all equal. Then you will not really care who is governing your city or your country, because the basic patriotism will be the same. And we have no better example in the world than that in Hawaii, where we have one Chinese and two Japanese, that is of descent, in the halls of Congress, and nobody questioning their patriotism, and no one questioning their intelligence, and no one questioning their culture. Why? Because the equality is not merely one of lip service. The equality is in their education, their culture, their spiritual endowment. And therefore nobody cares that Hawaii has 3 out of 4 Asiatics, that is of Asiatic descent, representing them. This is a tremendous lesson to remember. What difference eventually if everybody in Congress was a Negro or an Asiatic, if they all had the basic patriotism, education, culture, and spiritual endowment? Would it make any difference? Of course not. The Hebrews have lived in the United States as a minority, and they have been governed by Protestants and Catholics, and it didn't bother them one single bit. The Negroes have lived as a minority in the North, and they have been under the government of the whites, and they didn't care one single bit. So do you see how it is that the whole subject is being looked at from a wrong angle? The right angle is education, culture, spiritual endowment. This and this alone makes equality, not just by being born. This does not make equality. It should represent an equality of opportunity. It does not lie within our jurisdiction to decide these things humanly, but it is given to us to pray. It is given to us to pray that God's kingdom be realized on earth, that the activity of the Christ be made manifest in human consciousness, that the carnal mind be recognized for its non-power. That makes a spiritual underground. Let us localize this now into our immediate families, including our aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. And we do not have to look far to see the carnal mind operating. What shall we do? Shall we start crusading? You know better than to try to change your relatives or tell them what to do. That is not the way. The way for us is prayer, realizing the activity of Christ in human consciousness, realizing the non-power of the carnal mind, realizing that the carnal mind has no law. We are not sitting in judgment as to who or what the carnal mind is. we are nullifying it by realizing that whatever degree of it is still in us, it too has to be nullified. Yes, we know from family life that the carnal mind is operating, and we know that it will continue to operate until one with God realizes the activity of the Christ in human consciousness and the non-power of the carnal mind. The work must be kept on an impersonal basis. There must be no pointing of fingers at people or at ideologies. There must be no mental malpractice. There must only be the realization of the activity of the Christ and the non-power of the carnal mind, and then let it be. The carnal mind does not always act wickedly. President Harding was a very fine man and not a dishonest man, and yet corruption cost him his life. The carnal mind blinded him to what was going on and caused him to trust the wrong people. So even in a good man, the carnal mind operated to make him careless and trusting. When we talk about the non-power of the carnal mind, let us also be sure that we mean good humanhood, because that is the carnal mind too. How many times do you think good people are responsible for parasites? Yes, because in their goodness they want to help people, until eventually these people are no longer able to help themselves. This is the carnal mind acting as human good as well as human evil. What we want is the realization of the activity of Christ in human consciousness, and so in your world work, do not pray for peace and do not pray for equality or justice or prosperity or health. Just recognize Christ as the only power, the only consciousness, and the carnal mind as the arm of flesh or nothingness. If you understand that kind of world work, it will open up many ramifications of prayer for you. Take what I have given you, and then let the Father reveal whatever else is necessary in the nature of prayer. This is merely to show you in general the nature of your world work, and as you work with it, you can receive more specific instructions from within, because this type of prayer leads to inner communion. And this is where you are going within for light, wisdom, instruction, and because it is a two-way process of communion, it comes back and gives it to you. Sometimes it may just even say, not by might nor by power. And then you'll relax in the spirit and it will be done. Then you will be more deeply empowered from on high, and that is what counts, not these words. The spiritual power that flows is what counts. What degree of spiritual power ensues from your praying, from your communing? The one question this brings up is this: should these people who are out crusading and doing human good, should they not be doing this? The answer is, oh yes, they should, because that is the highest sense of service that they have at the moment. And some of these spiritual prayers may be raising up these individuals who are out crusading. In other words, I do not think Florence Nightingale went out and did all she did because she was a good human being. I believe that the Spirit of God animated her at every step. I do not think that the men in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Brazilian Revolution were all humanly good men. I think many were under spiritual orders and could not have done otherwise. Whether we might be the spiritual power that raises up that seed, or whether we are one of the seeds raised up to go out on the battlefront, we must not underestimate the value of those who are out on the front, more especially those who are out there under divine orders. You see, engaging in this work is a givingness, because it is inevitable that you will touch your soul center in some of these meditations, and those receptive will be blessed. But remember that in that givingness is the return of your bread on the waters unto yourself. And that without your placing this bread on the water, there is no bread out there to return to you. So it is that in every level of our life, the Master said, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Inasmuch as ye have not done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have not done it unto me. So remember, when you are doing this spiritual work, you are doing it unto the least of these my brethren, and you are doing it unto the very Christ of your own being. And remember that when you are not doing it for the least of these, the service or the prayer, you're just withholding from yourself. And in our work, in 30 years or more of this work, I have really learned that the only fruitage that really comes back to me and prospers me spiritually as well as materially is this dedication and this service to the least of these, to the greatest of these, call it what you will. The measure of my life in the past 30 years has been the measure of my prosperity and my inner joy and my outer experience. And that's why I share it so with you. Thank you. Please, students, realize that we have been making this tape while a road has been built outside of our door with heavy machinery and equipment, and make allowances. Thank you.